We could see no national boundaries, no vast gulfs or high walls dividing people.
We who are interested in the security of democracy,
as each side attempts to prove to the world the superiority of its position.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead because I've been to the mountaintop.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Senator Sam Nunn, welcome to the Georgia Historical Society.
Great to be with you.
We are here to talk about the Cold War at 75. This marks the 75th anniversary of the beginning of the Cold War immediately after World War II in 1945. And I just briefly want to introduce you. You were born in Macon, Georgia, attended Georgia Tech, graduated from Emory University and Emory Law School, served in the United States Coast Guard, came back to Georgia and practiced law, and then served in the Georgia House of Representatives. Then you were elected to the United States Senate in 1972 and served for 24 years until you left office in 1996, including 8 of those years as chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And since retiring from the Senate, you co-founded with Ted Turner and now co-chaired the Nuclear Threat Initiative. As I mentioned, we're here to talk about the events of the Cold War as you experienced them. So let's start with you. But when we think about the Cold War, the scariest moment of the Cold War was the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. Where were you in October 1962? And talk to us about your experience with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Well, Stan, I was 24 years old, and I had been a staff lawyer on the Armed Services Committee for about 3.5, 4 months. My boss was named John J. Courtney. He'd been there a long time, a great man with terrific legal ability and great judgment, a lot of experience. Well, he came in before he was due to get on an airplane with the Air Force and go on a NATO trip with about 10 or 12 other members, staff members of the Armed Services Committee in the House and Senate, as well as the Appropriation Committee. So this was a group of 45, 50-year-old senior experienced people. Bottom line, he came in and said, "Sam, I got a marriage in my family. My family says I got to go. I can't go on this NATO trip. Would you like to take my place?" I'd never been out of the country. And I said, "Yes, sir, I'd be glad to do it." So we left and had a 3-week trip to NATO. And right in the middle of the trip with the Air Force, Cuban Missile Crisis broke out. I had just received my top secret clearance right before I left.
And you were 24 years old at this time?
Just turned 24 years old, right out of law school. So we were actually briefed by the Air Force with photographs and all the classified information, sort of every step of the way once the Cuban Missile Crisis broke out. And it turned out that we were at Wiesbaden Air Force Base, which was sort of the head of U.S. Air Force Europe, on the night where it really looked like we were going to war. And I happened to be, because they rotated people who sat by the top general, and I happened to be sitting by the top Air Force general in Europe that night at dinner. And he had a whole big computer back of him with all sorts of communication equipment. During the course of the dinner, he told me that he had about 20, 30 seconds once he got the signal to basically turn loose his aircraft to go after the Soviet Union, because we thought we were going to war. That he had about 30 seconds to give his orders to his men, and he had them sitting, the pilots sitting by the planes. These were what they call QRA aircraft, quick reaction aircraft. One-way mission, one bomb toward Moscow. They had to bail out on the way back because these were fighter planes. The fact that they were basically the first to arrive, so to speak, they would get there long before our strategic bombers if war broke out and it became nuclear, which in all likelihood it would have, meant that that base was the prime target. It would have been the first hit. They were the first to go. So that brought home a sense of reality to me about the dangers of nuclear war that had an effect on the rest of my life. I remember jokingly, but not completely, telling the general, I said, "I'm delighted you turned your glass over with the wine and that you're not having any drinks tonight," because he had an awesome responsibility. So it brought home to me 2 things: how close we came to war and how much subjective judgment was involved in the Kennedy decisions and the Khrushchev decisions to avoid war. And second, how little warning time we had. And back in those days, there was more warning and decision time for leaders than there is now, because the airplanes flew much slower and they had fail-safe. You could call them back. But today we have missiles that are much faster. So the decision time for our leaders today, people don't think about it, much shorter, both for the Russian president as well as the U.S. president. That's a problem that I still work on and am concerned about, because having very little decision time in a moment of great crisis is extremely dangerous for the world. And that's, to me, one of the prime goals we should have today, which is to give both U.S. and Russian leaders more time so that we do not move into a war, nuclear war, by blunder. So a lot of lessons came out of that trip in 1962, and it really did affect an awful lot of what I did in the Armed Services Committee and still do today in terms of working on reducing nuclear risk.
Was that trip instrumental in the decision that you would eventually make to run for the U.S. Senate? How did it shape the rest of your life?
Well, it had a lot to do with what I did once I got elected. Of course, the nuclear issues are never what you campaign on, because that's not something people really like to think about, and still don't. Don't blame them. But it did have an awful lot to do with my agenda once elected. In terms of running for the Senate, my ambition was to be a member of House of Representatives, because that's where I had served as a young lawyer. I saw Carl Vinson as chairman of the committee. He was in the peak of his power, and so the House was where I was really aiming. But the congressional district didn't become available for me in Middle Georgia. We were on the wrong end of the least populated area of a district that went east-west. So basically, I had planned to run for the House, didn't work out, and I ran for the Senate after Senator Russell died on a long shot that I got lucky. The Senate of the United States was beyond my ambition at that stage, but being in the Congress was very much something I was interested in.
You have said, talking about the risk of nuclear war during the Cold War, quote, "We were very lucky. There were a number of times that I know about, and probably a lot more that I don't know about, where only by the grace of God did we avoid going to war." Did you ever experience anything like the Cuban Missile Crisis again that maybe the American people don't know about?
Looking back on it, I have determined a lot of times where accidents could have happened, but in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the difference was it was public. Everybody knew it when it was happening. Now, when you look back, there were near accidents a number of times during the Cold War. We inadvertently dropped a nuclear bomb right off the Atlantic coast, not too many miles from Savannah, Georgia, that never was really retrieved. So we had all sorts of accidents. I think we had great professional military people. So did the Russians. They could have had an accident, a blunder, just as well as we could. And so I do think we were very professional in both the U.S. and the Soviet militaries. They were careful and so forth, so they get a lot of credit for that. We were also lucky. By the grace of God, we never had a war by accident. That is still a major concern. With the compressed warning time now, and with cyber tempting both adversaries, to the extent we are still an adversary with Russia, we still have huge amount of nuclear arsenals in both inventories deployed, and we have a shorter decision time than we did during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And when you introduce cyber and possible interference in command and control and warning systems, I still very much worry about compressed decision time. And if I had my way today, and I've told President Obama this, I've told President Trump this, and I've told President Putin this, that if I had my way, the leaders would call in their military and say, look, we have a mutual existential interest to give each other more warning time, and go off and find ways to give us, if we've got 4 minutes now, hypothetically, give us 10 minutes. And if we got 10 minutes, give us 20. And if we got 20, give us an hour, and then a day, and then a week. And then you make nuclear weapons less relevant. That's the course we have to have to get the weapons down in inventory. It's not simply a matter of reducing numbers. It has to do with survivability, being able to absorb a first strike and still retaliate. That's necessary for deterrence. So this is a highly technical area, but it is enormously important for the public to realize that, for instance, it's in the U.S. interest for the Russian warning systems to work correctly today. It's not in our interest to interfere with those warning systems, which could set off a nuclear war by accident. So the chances stand of a nuclear war by accident miscalculation are much greater than the chances of a deliberate premeditated attack. And those who've written history like Graham Allison have found out later, looking at Russian history and interviewing American leaders, that during that Cuban Missile Crisis, the chances of a blunder were very, very high. There were certain authorities that had been delegated to the Soviet commanders at sea and on ground in Cuba that we didn't know about at that time. So we came very close during that period of time to a deliberate war, but a war that could have still been started that nobody wanted. And today this is all still relevant. We should find ways to make the world safer and to reduce nuclear risk. So this, from 1962 to the year 2020, there's still a lot of similarities.
Can you talk to me about your 1974 visit to the U.S. Tactical Nuclear Weapons Storage Base in Germany? You did an inspection, and everything you were told was great, and you said a sergeant slipped you a note and said, "See me afterwards."
That's right. Senator Stennis had been shot by a burglar, nothing to do with an assassination, in '73, right after I got to the Senate. He kind of relied on me from '74 on, when he came back, to take trips and to come back and report. So he had assigned a top staff person to me by the name of Frank Sullivan. He couldn't have been a better staff person. He was very knowledgeable. We were touring a tactical nuclear weapon base in NATO, in Germany. We had hundreds of them, thousands actually, and so did the Soviets. These are short-range systems that are used on the battlefield. So we were touring that base, and of course it was highly sensitive in terms of security, and it was post-Vietnam. It was right in the winding down of Vietnam. So you had a demilitarized, demoralized American military. The Army had all sorts of problems in Vietnam, had been a bad experience. There were drugs, there was alcohol, there was so forth. We were touring this tactical nuclear base, and of course, we got what I call the dog and pony show. The top generals will tell you everything's fine. We got security. As we were walking around, a sergeant handed me a crumpled note and said, in effect, "Senator, this is all BS. If you'll join my buddies and me in a barracks, we'll tell you what's really going on." And he said like 5 o'clock, but clear he didn't want any military officers there. There was a lot of strain between enlisted and officers at that stage because of Vietnam. So my great staff person, Frank Sullivan, and I went, and we heard a whole litany of horrors. The electronic fences were not working properly. There was no really dogs were not really patrolling the perimeter. There was alcohol problems among the guards. There was narcotics problems. Bottom line is, the police that would have, German police that would have come to be the first rescuers if there was, let's say, 10 or 15 people that broke into the base and tried to seize those weapons. Not necessarily to set them off, but to change the whole political equation. Because you had the Baader-Meinhof gang there then, you had terrorism going on, people were being kneecapped, huge animosity among a lot of the young people toward America because of Vietnam. Mm-hmm. So it was a bad situation. I remember I was so alarmed about the state of those tactical nuclear weapons, the security of those weapons, that when I went back to Washington, Andrews Air Force Base, Jim Schlesinger was Secretary of Defense, and I had sent word in advance, "I'm coming straight to your office when I get back." I didn't even go to my home or my office. I went straight over and sort of dumped it all in his lap and told him we had a bad security problem then. And of course, he set about doing a lot of changes to do something about it. So protecting those weapons, not because necessarily some group was going to seize them and use them, that would be a little more complicated, but because it would have tremendously disrupted the whole political relationship if, even for 10 hours, a group of terrorists had controlled a tactical nuclear weapon base, which was entirely possible because it was in a pretty remote area. But I learned from that yes, listen to the generals and the admirals because they see it from a broad point of view, and we've got tremendous military leadership, did then and still do. But you also need to listen to the sergeants and the enlisted people out there who are on the front line, because they can tell you what's really going on, and they will usually be pretty darn frank about telling you what the problems are.
You were serving in the U.S. Senate during Watergate, and when President Richard Nixon resigned in 1974, was there ever any concern among congressmen or among any of national security people in the transition to power? We'd never had a president resign before. With the turmoil that was going on in the White House, was there ever any concern about nuclear weapons?
Well, there was, but when you talk about chaos and turmoil, I know people think today, well, how could it be any more chaotic, divided country? And we do have a lot of problems today. But back then, if you look back, I got elected in 72. By 1976, in 4 years, I served with 3 presidents and 4 vice presidents in a 4-year period. So we had a lot of turmoil going on, and there was a lot of tension when President Nixon was under tremendous investigation, a lot of pressure. And according to all the reports, I didn't know it at the time, but he was engaged much more heavily in alcohol than would have been the case normally. My understanding is, and I've talked to him about it personally because he was a friend of mine, but he never responded. I asked him the question 2 or 3 times, and Secretary of Defense Jim Schlesinger was reported to have said to the military commanders, and he never verified it directly, although a wink and a nod told me a little bit. He said, if you get a call from the president, check with either me or the Secretary of State first before you carry out any serious orders involving nuclear weapons. So yes, we had some serious problems then. And it raises the question, both in Russia and the United States, and to some extent China also, do you want one person as the sole authority to be able to launch a nuclear war and destroy God's universe? Do you really want one person to make that decision? My answer after a long number of years is no. But to move beyond sole authority and to continue to have the kind of deterrence you need is a very tricky proposition and would require the Congress to organize itself in a very different way than it is organized today, because somebody's got to be able to make a rapid decision, whether it's a group of people or one person. That decision has to be very rapid if you're going to continue deterrence. So, Stan, this is a live question today. There's a debate with the virus going on and so forth. Nobody's paying attention at this stage, but there's a serious debate about whether we ought to continue in perpetuity, as long as we have this huge arsenal of nuclear weapons, sole authority, meaning the president can make that decision alone. You not only have sole authority, and most people in the country don't know that, but you also have very compressed decision time. And I think all of us, whether it's a Russian president or US president, if a general walks in and says, we think we're under attack, we may be hit in the next 15 minutes, you've got to launch your weapons now or we lose them. When that happens, you would like for the leader to have time to consult, time to think, time to perhaps, if he'd had a couple of glasses of wine for dinner, to have a black cup of coffee. I think we would all like that. So that's where the nexus between sole authority and decision time comes in. But you have to be very careful about how you set up any authority beyond simply the president because of that compressed time frame.
Historically, the United States was the first nuclear country. We developed the atomic bomb in 1945, the Soviets in 1949, and of course, the technology moved on beyond the atomic weapons. How many nations today are nuclear powers?
Well, in terms of nuclear weapon states that actually have nuclear weapons, there are 9 countries. Been several countries added, including India and Pakistan and, quote, reportedly Israel. And of course, you have the French and you have the British and you have the Chinese and you have the US and you have the Russians. But one of the bits of good news people don't realize is after the Soviet Union broke up, 3 countries gave up all their nuclear weapons because Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine all inherited a part of the Soviet arsenal that was on their territory. But after a lot of work in the Clinton administration, and people didn't realize that was going on, we and Russia working together got 3 of those countries to give up their nuclear weapons. And it's an interesting story there. One of the ways that we attracted particularly Ukraine and Kazakhstan to get rid of their nuclear weapons is the material, the highly enriched uranium in the weapons is worth something because you blend it down and you can burn it as a civil fuel for civil power plants. At one point, we made a deal with Russia and those other 2 countries that they would bring their weapons back to Russia. Russia would dismantle them. Then we would work with Russia to convert it to nuclear fuel, and we bought it for our nuclear power plants. 20% of the electricity in this country, 19 point something, is still electricity, is still nuclear power. So during a period from about 94 to about 2001, we bought enough fuel from those weapons that had been dismantled and the highly enriched uranium made into fuel. We bought enough of that material for 50% of our fuel supply for the nuclear power plant. So if you do the arithmetic, 20% of electricity comes from nuclear, 50% of the fuel, 10% of all the electricity in America, light bulbs, all of it, came from material that had been weapons pointed at us during the Cold War. That was a big, big move in the 1990s that not many people paid attention to. The Nunn-Lugar program, which Senator Lugar and I sponsored, sort of helped do that with the funding to get that started and with the funding to help those countries that inherited those weapons, as well as Russia, get control of their nuclear, their chemical, and their biological weapon program after 1991, the Cold War. And that basically resulted in the dismantling of thousands of nuclear warheads, destruction of many bombers, submarines, missiles, missile silos, and so forth. And particularly in the countries that decided not to keep nuclear weapons, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. And of course, Russia kept a lot of their weapons, but they also got rid of really thousands of nuclear weapons during that period of time, as did the United States. So now, with all the continuing problems we have with nuclear weapons, we have vastly smaller inventory, we and Russia, than we did during the peak of the Cold War, because we've gotten rid of a lot of the most destabilizing weapons, which are the theater short-range nuclear weapons that were stationed in Europe by the Soviets and by the United States. We still have too many of them, but those are the most destabilizing weapons because you deploy them near the front lines, which means if there is a war, all of a sudden a commander's got to make a decision. Do you get permission and use them, permission from the president, or do you let them get overrun and captured? So tactical battlefield nuclear weapons are the most destabilizing because you've got to use them or lose them if there's any kind of conventional war. And now we're seeing that nightmare unfold in Pakistan, with Pakistan and India, with Pakistan having their own tactical nuclear weapons. So they're kind of repeating one of the most dangerous phases of the Cold War that the United States and the Soviets went through. We haven't cured our problem, but we have much less danger of that today than we did when we had thousands of those weapons deployed in the front lines of the battlefield, and decisions had to be made very quickly to use them or lose them. So that phase of the Cold War, probably a good thing in many ways, the American people never fully realized, but we were postured in NATO for a long time, we and our European allies, Germany particularly, to basically use nuclear weapons very quickly and to ask the president. I don't think any president knew how quickly they were going to be asked for the authority by the battlefield commanders because we dismantled a lot of our military after World War II. The Soviets kept theirs. They had tremendous advantage with ground forces, with artillery, and with tanks. And therefore, sort of the first offset to that was the deployment of thousands of tactical nuclear weapons, battlefield nuclear weapons on the U.S. side. So all of that is part of the Cold War history, but still relevant today, both because there are residual weapons there, particularly the Soviets or Russians still have those weapons in Russian part of Europe. History is repeating itself with India and Pakistan, which may be one of the more dangerous places in the world where you have two weapon states with tremendous amount of tension.
Senator, you mentioned that you served in rapid succession in the 1970s with 3 presidents. You served overall with 6 during the terms of administrations of 6 presidents: Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton. You said that when you were running for senator, you didn't really talk about nuclear weapons because it wasn't a kitchen table issue, so to speak, for voters. For those who didn't grow up during the Cold War, who were born long after, did it enter presidential politics? I know that then as now, we talk about who's tough on terrorism, and I know that Democrats and Republicans accuse the other of being soft on communism or who was going to be tougher on Russia. But did presidents, was it part of the campaign that they wouldn't hesitate? You mentioned some presidents maybe didn't know how quickly they would be called upon. Was it an issue for American presidents to say, I wouldn't hesitate to use nuclear weapons? Did any president say, I have a moral problem?
Well, it came to the forefront in terms of the public back when Lyndon Johnson was running against Barry Goldwater. And you remember there was an advertisement because the case was trying to be made that Barry Goldwater was, ready, fire, aim type.
Said he was going to lob one into the men's room at the Kremlin, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Goldwater used colorful language. I love the guy, by the way. But that was an issue in that campaign, and it probably had a real effect. Mm-hmm. I have talked to a number of leaders, and I wouldn't identify any presidents in this crowd that seriously would think very, very, probably long and hard before they would actually give an order to release nuclear weapons. And that includes some top people in the military command. So it is a moral question, but every military commander is charged with the responsibility of carrying out orders from the commander-in-chief. But those orders have to be moral orders. And how do you determine that? Do you have 10 New York lawyers come in the middle of a crisis and say, this is legal and moral? No. So it gets down to judgment. But generally speaking, the rule, and I think we all have to assume this in Russia and the United States and France and Great Britain and China, India and Pakistan, when military gets an order, they generally speaking are going to carry it out. And in some ways, deterrence depends on that, because if there was doubt that a president would use nuclear weapons, then what is deterrence? Because deterrence has to be, if you are hit with nuclear weapons, then you will retaliate. The problem today that I think we could cut some of the risks, certainly not all of it, if we made a position known in America that we will not use nuclear weapons first. We would only use them in response. Now, to do that, you have to be able to survive a nuclear attack. Our submarines give us that ability because at this stage, they're not detectable. So survivability is very important, because if you're not going to use nuclear weapons first, you have to be able to absorb that attack and then be able to retaliate. Deterrence psychologically depends on that. The same applies to Russia. If the Russian president decides that they cannot survive a nuclear attack, then if he gets a warning, then he is not going to wait until basically he's hit. He would probably launch on warning. Problem, a warning could be false, particularly in a cyber world where you have interference in command and control, possibly by even third countries. So we've moved into a new era of nuclear with technology, with cyber, and I don't think that has been realized. And I think the president of Russia and the president of the United States, that we have existential interest in each other's warning systems working properly And I think we have an existential interest, and they do also, in giving a president more decision time. We at NTI now, flashing forward to today, we have developed a little game, sort of a war game called Hair Trigger, and it walks through the kind of decision making a president would have to make, and it puts whoever's playing the game in the position of making decisions that could lead to nuclear war or could help prevent nuclear war. And so that's kind of the game that unfortunately is still relevant. I think the world has to worry. We can say everybody's sovereign and countries have the right to make it, sure. But if India and Pakistan had a war with each other and hypothetically had 100 weapons go off, and they both have substantially more than that, it could cause global cooling in this world, which some computer runs, I can't certify this, but indicate, 100 million people would die of starvation over the next 10 years because of the effect on the atmosphere. So there is a world stake in all of this. Einstein supposedly said that when the nuclear weapon first tested, he said, basically, we've changed everything now. This changes everything except man's thinking. He also, a quote attributed to him, is whether it's accurate or not, I don't know, but it's pretty darn descriptive, said, I know not which weapons will be used in World War III, but I do know that World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. So this is God's universe we're talking about, and it should not be taken lightly by decision makers. But also, I think the public has to become more knowledgeable and involved in this, not just in the U.S., but in Russia, in China, in Great Britain, in France, in Pakistan, India, because at some point deterrence will work until it doesn't work. Give you a comparison. The epidemiologists have been telling us we were going to have a pandemic for the last 15 years. Our organization, NTI, is involved in the biological side too, which is another whole set of problems. But people didn't pay a lot of attention. Our public health facilities, our access to medicine by a huge part of our population, we didn't take care of those things. And we didn't have an epidemic until we had one. Well, anyone that thinks deterrence, that has really looked at this, that thinks deterrence is going to prevent nuclear use forever, I think is postulating a best case, which is highly unlikely. And so I think we have to begin to rope off the existential interest we have with countries like Russia and China. And we have to have disagreements in a lot of other areas, but still come back and say, we've got to deal with each other. We have mutual interest of survivability, not just in the nuclear area, but in the bio area, the pandemic area, and increasingly, longer term, in the climate area. And we've got to be able to deal with this. The way I describe it on these existential interests, we're in a race between cooperation and catastrophe. And we're not, in my view, coming to grips with that. When I say we, I mean not just the United States, I mean Russia, and I mean China. One country cannot solve this. We have to work it together, and we have to work it even when our value systems are not the same, even when we don't agree on human rights, even when we have different geographic interests, even when we have trade disputes, we still have to work these existential problems together. And to me, that's the message that has not gotten through in any country, and we got to figure out a way to do that. We being the leadership in this country, but at the same time, it doesn't do much good for one country to come to the conclusion, yeah, we got to do X, Y, Z. It takes more than one to do it. Otherwise, deterrence gets weakened, but you haven't gained anything. So these are enormously difficult problems, but when you consider the stakes, and the stakes are God's universe, it's worthy of our full focus.
One of the things we haven't talked about is China. I know you made a trip to China in 1975. I've read your journal that you kept that I think was published in the Atlanta newspapers at that time. Your impression then and now of the country that some people would say has replaced Russia as America's great now international enemy.
I think you have to kind of divide it between economic and political and sort of the governance, political and military. And from a nuclear point of view, Russia is still the greatest threat by far. China has a couple of hundred warheads. Nobody knows exactly. They're not transparent, but nothing like the Russians. China economically is a fully matured competitor.
A juggernaut.
In terms of the economic side. They are a very strong country economically, and they are a very strong country in terms of their education quest, and they're also their ambitions and their trade position in the world. They also are a very strong regional power. Now, if you put the United States Navy out in the middle of the ocean against the Chinese Navy, no contest. But that's not where a war would occur. It occur close to their shores. And China's policy is to build up enough of a military arsenal, missiles and so forth, to prevent the United States from intervening in a regional conflict, for instance, Taiwan. So we do have tensions with China. But we also, if you look at our children and grandchildren, and you look at the Chinese trajectory and where they're headed, yes, competitor, but we've got to find ways to work with them, just like we have to find ways to work with Russians. And we can't wait until we all agree on the value system. We're not going to agree with them on human rights. We have to, again, for instance, if we're going to make progress on climate and the global warming and the carbon problem, we got to deal with China. So we're going to have to become more sophisticated in our foreign policy, where both political parties and the general public understand we've got to work with these countries on existential type interest. I hate to overuse that word. Let's call it survivable type challenges. And I would include bio in that. We just are now seeing the seriousness of that effect. The only time I've ever heard the word species ending used in a war game was not in a nuclear war game, it was in a biological war game. Species ending, that's pretty chilling when you think of it. Mm-hmm. So we've got to find ways to work with China. First time I went to China, 75, Chairman Mao, Zhou Enlai, Premier, were still alive. We didn't meet with them. We met with a leader we had never heard of. We probably should have, but we hadn't. Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping. The last 50 years, 60 years, probably he has had as much influence on developments in the world as any one human being. Tremendous amount of change in China since 1975. When I went there, bicycles everywhere, no cars, women basically in drab type, colorless clothes, people on the streets everywhere walking. Today, if you go to China, everybody who goes there says, you know, what's happened to the China of the 70s and the 60s. It's a changed situation.
To be clear, China is still communist?
They are communism with a market approach. They have one political party. Certainly they don't have pluralism. Certainly they don't have anything like our value system, our human rights system. Certainly they don't have the kind of freedoms we do in this country. But they do believe in market forces and incentives, and that was a change that Deng Xiaoping made. In our first conversation with him in 75, I was over there on a trip with about 10 senators. Deng Xiaoping was asked the question, we read, Mr. Vice Premier, that you have 1 billion people, and then we read other articles saying you have 1.5 billion people. How many people are there in China? He spit his tobacco out, which he did frequently, and said, Senator, always believe the lower number. Lower number, why? He said, because we have villages that store grain, and they're able to retain grain for their own village based on the population. The rest of it they send to the state, to the government. So what do? In census, when the census taker comes around, and determining how many people are there, which determines how much grain retained in the village, they have all the little children run in front of the census taker, so the children get counted 3 and 4 times. So they maximize the population. Now in China in 1975, that was sort of violating every code of Chairman Mao, which was all for one, we're all in it together, everybody's patriotic, everybody's honest, except full of propaganda. Everything was Chairman Mao's thoughts, Little Red Book. Deng Xiaoping was saying, we've got to develop an incentive system. We have one. The Chinese believe in incentives, but the system doesn't allow it. That was a signal that he was going to change fundamentally China, which he did. He changed China because he created the incentive system within the communist system. That's hard to do, but basically he did it. And they still have an autocratic government. Would I call it pure communism, from each according to his need, from each according to his capability? I don't call it that. I think it is an incentive system in an autocratic society. Do we agree with it? No, but are there a lot of countries in the world that are looking to China as a model now? Yes. So they are a full-fledged competitor. We've got to take them seriously. We've got to deal with them firmly on issues where we don't agree, but we've got to carve out areas where we do agree, where we have mutual interest, and work with them. The future of our children and our grandchildren and the future of the Chinese young people depend on wise leadership that can identify the mutual interest and find ways to reduce the tensions and the dangers of those interests where we are fundamentally apart.
So Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power in 1985, begins to make reforms in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union as an empire crumbles by 1991. Eastern Europe is free of Soviet control. Was there any fear as the Soviet Union as an empire began to crumble that the nuclear weapons were going to fall into the wrong hands? I know that I want you to tell the story about asking Gorbachev during that coup that happened if he retained control of Soviet nuclear weapons.
He didn't answer the question. One of my Soviet, i.e. Russian friends, got called back when Gorbachev was taken captive, the coup attempt. A couple of days later, Gorbachev was released. I was still in Budapest. My friend by the name of Andrei Kokoshin, who later became the Deputy Minister of Defense in Russia, he's still there in Russia today, still a friend. He called me and said, you've got to come to Russia, Sam. You've got to call me. You got to come to Russia. Immediately said things are really changing, and that was after Gorbachev had been released. So long story short, I got an immediate visa that he arranged. I got on a train and went to Frankfurt, then I flew from Frankfurt to Russia. I spent or the Soviet Union then, it was still the Soviet Union, I spent the next 5 days being introduced to the new leaders. These were the Yeltsin people, because the coup against Gorbachev resulted in a shift of power to Yeltsin. There was still a Soviet Union, but Yeltsin was the president of Russia. And everybody then was talking Russia, not Soviet Union, Russia this and Russia that. So things were changing dramatically. One of the most interesting sessions, I sat there with the leaders of all the Soviet republics, Kazakhstan and the other Soviet republics, with Gorbachev presiding, where they were debating the breakup of the Soviet Union. And I concluded during that 5-day visit that this empire was coming apart, and it was the only time in history that an empire had come apart without any kind of war at all. There was no military victory as such, but the economic system had collapsed. Their system was internally inconsistent. It wouldn't work. So they were coming apart, but the thing that was so dangerous was they were possessing like 30,000 nuclear weapons. They had 40,000 tons of chemical weapons. They had a weaponization of germs, biological program. They even, we believe, had weaponized smallpox. So all of that was happening, and that, long story short, I concluded that we, the United States, had to help them get control of their nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. By them, I didn't mean just Russia, but Kazakhstan, Belarus, Ukraine. They all had thousands of nuclear weapons. And they scientists and technologists that knew how to make nuclear weapons and chemical and biological. They knew how to make these awful weapons. They didn't know how they were going to feed their families. This was literally, I felt, a world crisis. So I came back, make a long story very short. Senator Lugar joined forces with me, great Republican leader, terrific friend, very influential and respected. And we introduced what was called the Nunn-Lugar bill, became the Nunn-Lugar bill later. First time we tried it, before Senator Lugar joined in September, I had to pull it back on the Armed Services Committee, even though I was chairman. Outrage broke up. How could you help people who have been our enemy all these years? It was an assault from left and right. 3 months later, we had met with a lot of senators. We'd gotten people that understood the situation, how dangerous it was, to come in and meet. We had small group meetings. December of 1991, as an amendment to an appropriation bill, not the bill I controlled in the Armed Services Committee, we passed the Nunn-Lugar legislation with $500 million, I think it became $400 million, to help them get control of their own chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons safely, and to help scientists who knew how to make a weapon and would be very valuable to another number of countries in the world that wanted to make their own nuclear weapons or chemical or biological, but didn't know how to feed their families. And so we were able to pass that legislation in December 91 in the House and Senate. The Bush administration was kind of cool to it, but the president didn't threaten to veto it. We worked with them. We talked to the Secretary of State. We talked to the Secretary of Defense. And gradually they came around. And so we had the executive branch and the Congress basically in a position to try to greatly reduce the risk that was a terrible risk at that stage about what would happen with what became known as loose nukes, where there was all sorts of incentive for people that had access to the weapons and materials. We worried just as much about the materials because with today's knowledge, a terrorist group, basically, if they get nuclear materials, the right kind of highly enriched uranium, they would be able to make a crude weapon, not necessarily one to put on a missile. So preventing catastrophic terrorism became a huge fact at that stage with this nuclear material at that stage in some 40 countries around the world. Only 9 countries had nuclear weapons, but like 40 to 45 countries at that stage had weapons usable material, which if put together with the right scientist and terrorist group could be made into a crude weapon and take out a city or a port or an airport and change the world economically and psychologically. So that program was passed in 91. It started really being implemented vigorously in the Clinton administration, where Bill Perry became Secretary of Defense, and Bill Perry made this his #1 priority. And they had a team of terrific people around him, and we basically, with a lot of work with former enemies, we were able to, over a 10-year period, really destroy thousands, I think it was 8,000 or 9,000 nuclear warheads that they were willing to get rid of. It wasn't forced. Russia retained a good portion of their nuclear weapons. Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine gave up large numbers of weapons. Also, missile silos, missiles, bombers, submarines that were chopped up with the help of the so-called Nunn-Lugar funding. So that went on intensely for a decade, and was a program that I think the money was well spent, and most people agree with that.
Just for fun, all the people that you met through your career in the Senate, your time traveling abroad, all of the officials that you met in terms of the Cold War, what's the one Cold War personality who most impressed you, for good or ill, in all of the time that you were in public service?
Let me just turn the question a little bit, spin it a little bit different. Who did I meet that had the most influence on affecting world events during this period of time? And I would say Gorbachev has to be in that list, because in my view, any predecessor, I think the system at some point was going to collapse. But humanity was blessed by the fact Gorbachev was in the leadership, because any of his predecessors, in my view, we would have had a bloodbath. It would not have been a peaceful collapse of an empire. So Gorbachev, in my view, he didn't save the system, but he saved humanity from probably the worst atrocities in history. It could have been. The other person, I certainly did not agree with him on many things, but Deng Xiaoping changed the world when he changed China. He created an incentive system in China, and he awakened the sleeping giant. And third, I would put the series of presidents we had from Truman all the way through H.W. Bush when the Cold War ended. Truman made some very gutsy decisions. H.W. Bush at the end made a lot of good decisions in terms of Germany, German reunification. He got rid of a huge number of excess, dangerous, risky nuclear weapons. He and Brent Scowcroft, who just passed away, huge effect. And of course, state of Georgia, Jimmy Carter, he put pressure on the Soviet system, and indeed all autocratic systems, not with military power per se, but with his emphasis on values and human rights and integrity and dignity and respect for human beings. That is the ultimate way you put pressure on regimes, and I think Carter doesn't get anything like the credit he deserves. And of course, Reagan made a tremendous contribution through his, not only his strong stand and firm stand against communism, but his recognition that Gorbachev was a different kind of leader. And most people in both parties didn't realize it when Reagan realized it. And Reagan and Gorbachev made one of the most profound statements in terms of nuclear risk and lessons of the Cold War when they said together that nuclear war cannot be won and therefore must not be fought. Right now, I wish that President Trump and President Putin would say the same thing. Does it get rid of nuclear weapons? No. Does it make a huge psychological difference in the minds of people, including military leaders? Yes. So that would be my series of impactful. I put all the presidents together because they all had a different perspective, but we stuck to the NATO alliance. We stuck to the leadership. We had sustainable policy for all of those years. We did not have preemptive wars, which some urged when we had nuclear advantage, and we gave the system time to work out. But then Deng Xiaoping changed the world. Gorbachev, in my view, helped save the world from catastrophe. That's the way I link it right now. And I would add two more people in the Middle East. I would add I would add President Sadat, who had a vision about peace in the Middle East, and I think his influence was enormous. And also Rabin in Israel, where he had a vision, was willing to reach out. Leadership in that area of the world still is very important, and we haven't had nearly enough enlightened leadership in the Middle East.
Senator, the Cold War, as we mentioned, has been over now almost 30 years. As we stand here now, 75 years after it first began, what lessons did we learn from it? Are we safer now than we were at the height of the Cold War when we worried about all this? What's the great legacy and lesson from the Cold War that Senator Nunn takes?
Well, there are many, but let me just name a few. One is that we do still have a nuclear posture that's extremely dangerous. I think there's less chance now of a deliberate nuclear war that would be something like a premeditated attack. I think there's actually more chance, more risk of a blunder. And I say that because the decision time has been compressed for the leaders. They don't have very long to make up their mind whether to launch in case they get warning from a general that they may be under attack, which might be a false warning. The cyber world has made everything more dangerous. Third parties, other states could attack warning systems, mistakes, blunders. So I worry more about a nuclear war by blunder than I did in the old days. The question of lessons learned, we made a lot of mistakes, we being the world after World War I. And World War II came about in part, large part, because of all the mistakes made after World War I. Remarkable leadership after World War II, moving into the Cold War period. We decided we were going to bring Japan and Germany back into the world of civilized, peaceful nations. Marshall Plan saved those countries as well as Eastern Europe. Remarkable act of generosity, one of the most unusual moments in history, actually. Leadership in creating NATO, leadership in containing the Soviet Union, not going to nuclear war when we had even an advantage, but buying time. Time means a lot in changing people and changing policies and reducing tensions. And then we had a remarkable leadership of American presidents, from Truman all the way through President H.W. Bush, including Reagan, including all the presidents, Democratic presidents and Republican presidents. Remarkable continuity, standing with our allies, which is still relevant today, helping defend Europe, deterring the Soviet Union, containing, not going to war unless we were pushed to the brink, which fortunately we were not. We went through Vietnam and Korea, hot wars during the Cold War. We still decided wisely not to use nuclear weapons. So all sorts of lessons from the Cold War. A basic lesson is one in economics. The Soviet Union did not get defeated militarily. So when people talk about winning, it wasn't in the military sense. It was in the economic sense. Their system had internal contradictions economically and could not work in the long term because it did not have private enterprise incentives. It didn't even have the kind of blend that China has between an autocratic system and an incentive system, which they seem to have made work pretty darn well. So lots of lessons learned in economics and military and human behavior. And the residual is that today, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Cold War, if somebody asked me, were we closer to the World War I model and in the aftermath of the Cold War, or we were closer to World War II? And I would say somewhere in between, because even though some truth to the fact, quote, we won, the economic system, the political system, governance system of the West, quote, won. The military contained, we won in the sense we did not have a hot war. That was what containment by George Kennan and deterrence was all about. But we did not win in the sense that the Russians thought they were defeated. In fact, the Russians that were sort of the leaders of the Yeltsin movement felt that they were themselves were the ones who broke away from the Soviet Union. They were the ones who broke up the empire. Now, we saw it differently, but they felt that Russia itself had led the way in getting rid of a system that did not work. So we went through that period of time where there was a window, psychological window, enormously important to the future of Russia. We did some things inadvertently that I think were a mistake, and I thought so at the time. I did not think we should have extended NATO immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I felt we should help extend the economic side, reaching out to Eastern Europe through the European Union, but not as a Soviet military was collapsing, move American presence into areas that were right near their border, America presence through NATO. And so we made some mistakes after the Cold War. So where are we between the lessons of World War I, which I'd give us very poor marks, and lessons of World War II, which I think were unique in the history of the world in terms of A pluses, and the post-Cold War, somewhere in between. We've got a lot of work to do so that our children and grandchildren can live in a world that does not have the perils of nuclear, biological, climate change, all of those things hanging over us. I'd close with the thought that we really are in a race between cooperation and catastrophe on what I call the issues of survival. And it's going to take wise leadership, both in America as well as in countries that are adversaries from time to time, and Russia certainly is in that category at the moment, but also including China. And I think that another lesson we learned is that acting through alliances with the U.S. leading is the most powerful way to make our presence known and to really have a tremendous influence on values in the world. And finally, I would say that we influence countries abroad by our example as much as we do by our economic and military power. And the example of America working together, rallying together, coming together after elections, putting our country in front of our political parties, which we're not doing very well these days, that in the final analysis, as well as standing for human rights and values and human dignity, is enormously important for the future. That's where our strength is. We may defend ourselves with our military, but in terms of projecting influence in the world, we do it through our governance at home and our example, and we should never forget that.
Senator Nunn, thank you for coming to the Georgia Historical Society and participating in this program today.
Thank you very much, Stan. Thank you for the role this society plays in our state. It's a tremendous organization, and I think it has a tremendous effect on our children, our grandchildren, and letting people understand history and learn from the lessons of history so that we do not repeat the mistakes and build on the basic opportunities in front of us.
Thank you.